Well, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you and welcome to the Stimson Center. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at Stimson. For those of you that are attending this very event for the second time, many apologies. It was not, as you may have assumed, our speaker's agenda that caused that cancellation, but an exploding manhole. But we started paying our bills here at the Stimson Center again, and we're back in business and very pleased to be welcoming Dr. Chris Ford back to the Stimson stage. Chris, for those of you in the know, is, of course, the Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation. Chris previously had done a tour on President Trump's NSC. He worked previously on Capitol Hill at the Hudson Institute, Naval Reserves, but most importantly, he's just an all-around great guy, and I'm sure this conversation is going to be a lot of fun. Fun fact, he hails from Cincinnati, home of the Findlay Market, I might add. Chris, right? Huh? Not bad. No relation. No, sorry. So what we thought we would do, Chris is going to give a few framing remarks and then leave a little bit of time for us to ask some clarifying questions. But with that, Chris, welcome back to Stimson.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks, Brian. It's great to be back here. I applaud your persistence after last time and rescheduling this after the explosion. It sounds so dire. It's actually not that bad. Those of you who've been around Washington as long as I have will remember that there was a series of exploding manholes, I think, in Georgetown in perhaps the mid-1990s or so, and apparently that problem has not entirely gone away. But thanks for keeping at it, and thanks for all of you who were willing to come back, notwithstanding all the rescheduling. So it's been nearly 10 years since the first nuclear security summit was held here in Washington, D.C. There were 3 more after that, and they brought many world leaders together to declare their support for improving nuclear security practices. We all know that. While, in my own view, some of the objectives declared at the outset of that process were perhaps more ambitious than the facts would justify, the summits did play a really valuable role in drawing attention to the challenges of nuclear security. Because participating countries were encouraged to come up with, or to sign up to gift baskets, as they were called, of promised nuclear security improvements, the meetings did elicit some important pledges to address nuclear security challenges. But a decade after President Obama made his promise in 2009 to secure all vulnerable material around the world within 4 years, a decade later, all too much remains still to be done. Despite that within 4 years rhetoric, the world has got a lot to do, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what we are doing to try to help move that forward. So as the summits recede now into the past, the world's leaders must not, of course, forget about nuclear security. It's our challenge today, I would argue, to institutionalize and to regularize nuclear security best practices, to make good nuclear security into nothing special in the sense, as I have suggested before, that it becomes ordinary and habitual and natural to all states and to all stakeholders, in the same way that breathing is to any individual human. Where the summits played a valuable role in jump-starting attention to these challenges, in other words, we must now all do together the longer-term work of making sound nuclear security into a day-to-day habit rather than just a pledge. In a world in which terrorist organizations do seek to acquire nuclear or other radioactive materials, nuclear security is far too important not to be routinized. So if the summit process represented something akin to the kind of New Year's resolution, if you will, that so many people make in order to sort of lose weight and get in shape, that kind of thing, promises that may catalyze one to go to the gym and eat right and work out every day for a while, but thereafter to fade back into something more like the status quo ante. In the nuclear security arena, we now need something much more akin to a long-term health program. We need a new normal that establishes healthy patterns that can and that will be sustained indefinitely. To be sure, the day-to-day routinized promise keeping involved in ensuring sound nuclear security best practices and institutionalizing these practices worldwide is not easy. It also lacks the intuitive political draw of flashy summit promise-making, and there is still far to go before such practices are routine everywhere. But bringing that very outcome about is, or should be, I would argue, the core of our collective nuclear security agenda. One of the ways in which we have been trying to advance this agenda is through the work of the Nuclear Security Contact Group, the NSCG, an informal and voluntary cluster of states committed to improving nuclear security worldwide, and that gather periodically to compare notes, to encourage each other, and to coordinate their own sovereign national efforts to promote effective steps forward. I will admit that even among NSCG members, progress has been somewhat slower than one might have hoped in generating sustained attention and energy that these challenges require, but there is a good deal going on, and we're proud of it. As can sometimes happen in such well-intentioned international groups, there is sometimes too much of an assumption that simply being there demonstrates a real commitment to the cause and too little meaningful action. Members of the group are also making only limited progress against the toxic political narratives of disinterest or antagonism to nuclear security that still exist in some quarters, narratives that hinder improvements to security practices and which can thus also threaten the cooperative nuclear technology sharing that depends upon the reassurances that are provided by good security. But we have, as I indicated, seen signs of progress. Thanks in part, I believe, to contact group interventions and consciousness raising from like-minded member states, the IAEA has been able gradually over the past 2 years to increase its regular budget for nuclear security. The agency also continues to increase the profile and activity levels of its nuclear security work, as suggested in the 2013 evolution of its Office of Nuclear Security to a Division of Nuclear Security. The IAEA General Conference has made a modest but significant step forward in 2018 with its adoption of a nuclear security resolution, language emphasizing that nuclear security contributes to the positive perception of peaceful nuclear activities. Thankfully, the GC retained this language in 2019 in its nuclear security resolution, signaling that nuclear security and this role of good security practices in facilitating nuclear technology sharing is now clearly getting more sustained attention than before. The IAEA is now focusing more on nuclear security in ways that complement and reinforce both the agency's ongoing work in nuclear safety and its technical cooperation program as well. This new focus is helping to ensure that TC efforts are not derailed by the risk that they might lead to unauthorized access to sensitive technology or materials. As for the NSCG itself, the contact group itself, its deliberations recently produced a statement of collective commitments related to nuclear security. This document, which is now available on the NSCG website, is not the sort of consensus-negotiated lowest common denominator text that one often sees from multilateral fora, nor is it simply a high-level summary of inconclusive group deliberations. Instead, it is an informal food-for-thought statement designed to pull useful strands of thinking together in a constructive way to help inspire and channel efforts to move forward on the nuclear security agenda more effectively. I'm proud of the role the United States has been able to play in bringing this document together, in helping lead the group in this respect, and we hope that this document will indeed prove useful in encouraging constructive thought about how states can play more effective roles in promoting nuclear security, both within the NSCG and more broadly. So let me talk a little bit about the paper. Many of you may have seen it. It's available on the NSCG website. It's entitled Our Collective Commitment, and it says a great many things, I should say, that I think are important and that can helpfully contribute to an international agenda in this respect. To begin with, it reiterates our commitment, of course, to the October 2016 Statement of Principles that the IAEA Circular 899 sent around that founded the NSCG, making clear that those principles are still very much at the core of where the group is coming from. This paper also makes clear that good nuclear security is required in order to prevent nuclear weapons proliferation and terrorism involving nuclear weapons or materials, and in order to ensure the maintenance of a strong foundation for sharing the benefits of the peaceful uses of nuclear technology. Now, that latter statement, I would argue, is particularly important because it highlights the way in which, rather than competing with each other, nuclear security and nuclear technology sharing actually go hand in hand. Specifically, nuclear security improvements are clearly identified in the paper as a crucial enabler for sharing the benefits of the peaceful uses of nuclear technology worldwide, because they help form the foundation upon which rests the global system of technology sharing that has already provided untold benefits to all humankind, and in which we intend to help preserve, for many years to come. That's the quote from the paper. Now, to most of you, this probably seems, as it does to me, like basic common sense. It seems pretty obvious to me that it would be difficult to imagine the continuation or expansion of today's worldwide sharing of the benefits of nuclear know-how without confidence that nuclear technology and materials would be reliably kept out of the hands of unauthorized persons, such as terrorists. Nevertheless, there are still some people who don't see good nuclear security practices as an enabler or a facilitator for technology sharing, instead worrying that security equities exist in some kind of tension with the global cooperative enterprise. Now, thankfully, this view, of course, is wrong, and I'm pleased that the NSCG's collective commitment paper makes it so clear that there is not a tension here, but rather a strong complementarity. But the paper doesn't just voice this important insight about how security reinforces sharing. It also articulates a number of practical topics or themes of emphasis, points of emphasis that can provide points of focus and attention for us as NSCG members and the broader nuclear security community work to identify where their efforts can be most successful. It stresses, for instance, the importance of each state ensuring an adequate national nuclear security legislative and regulatory framework, while pointing out also that countries can play important roles in assisting each other as appropriate in developing and maintaining such best practices through cooperative capacity building. It makes clear that states should strengthen their own legal and regulatory frameworks by such things as promoting universal adherence to and implementation of relevant legally binding instruments, for example, such as the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, as well as the universal implementation of Security Council Resolution 1540, which of course seeks to prevent the spread of weapons of mass destruction to non-state actors by mandating the protection of sensitive goods and know-how, ensuring that relevant transfers between states are appropriately regulated. The paper emphasizes the importance of all states improving their own national nuclear security practices, such as through protecting against insider and cyber threats, strengthening the security of radioactive sources, ensuring training and preparedness, coordinating with nuclear security support centers, and reconciling nuclear safety and security and sharing best practices with other countries. This paper places a strong emphasis upon expanding the IAEA's nuclear security efforts as well, encouraging its work in this regard, but also stressing that the agency must undertake this work with vigor and attentiveness, providing its nuclear security promotional activities with the resources and political and institutional support and encouragement that they need in order to succeed, not least through regularizing IAEA budgets for nuclear security and core activities, and encouraging new donors and the diversification of funding sources within the extra budgetary funding base. The paper advocates for close coordination between the TC program and integrated nuclear security support plans, noting again the critical role of nuclear security as an enabler for sharing the benefits of peaceful uses of nuclear technology. Now, in our view, this paper is a very valuable way forward to help guide all of our collective approaches here, and we think it will be very useful. I encourage people to read it and to try to focus and spread awareness of the points that it raises. We are trying to use this as a stepping stone for our own engagement with other partners in this, and hopefully like-minded states in the nuclear security contact group can and will do likewise. In practical terms, in the work that we are doing at the State Department, for example, in addition to working bilaterally with our partners in all the ways that I just described, we have a great deal of engagement with the very kind of capacity building that was referenced in the paper itself. Our Office of Nuclear Energy Safety and Security, for example, leads efforts to develop and implement policies and diplomatic strategies that are related to nuclear security, such as co-chairing several U.S. interagency coordinating bodies focused upon nuclear security. This group supports our engagement with the Nuclear Security Contact Group. It serves as the department's lead on interagency physical protection assessment teams tasked with ensuring adequate physical protection of U.S. obligated materials abroad and efforts of that sort. Our Office of Multilateral Nuclear and Security Affairs assists in implementing the efforts of the IAEA's Division of Nuclear Security that I mentioned before to help prevent nuclear terrorism through efforts to minimize risks associated with vulnerable material. Our Weapons of Mass Destruction Terrorism Office, that's against it rather than for it, provides a focal point for our work against terrorists acquiring nuclear or radioactive materials outside regulatory control, including those lost during the breakup of the Soviet Union. The WMDT office manages our role as the co-chair, by the way, of the 89-member global initiative to combat nuclear terrorism, which is, incidentally, one of the bright spots of U.S.-Russian cooperation. We co-chair GICNT with the Russians, and we recently are in a new iteration of that co-chairmanship was just started up last year, and it's been a quite an effective cooperation, I must say. So we work with the Nuclear Forensics International Technical Working Group to identify and socialize best practices in nuclear forensics with foreign partners, such as the IAEA and Interpol and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, in many sorts of ways. These are multiple facets of how we engage on these issues, and through our Office of Export Control Cooperation, we do a great deal of capacity building assistance to help countries bring up their best practices in ways that complement these goals very effectively, as well as in our Office of Cooperative Threat Reduction. So that's just a sampler of the many ways in which the department engages with these kinds of questions. But let me sort of finish up a little bit in terms of drawing out where we see sort of the conceptual challenges as we look ahead at the future in the nuclear security arena. If you were to ask me what I think the main challenges are as we try to move from the era of promise-making to this era of what I think of as institutionalized promise-keeping, of normalizing best practices, if you will, I would probably point to what one might somewhat pithily call the 3 can'ts and the 2 won'ts. I'll explain what that means. Some countries may fall short in providing for adequate nuclear security because for one reason or another they simply cannot meet the standard. These are the can'ts, if you will. They might, for example, not be aware of the need for good nuclear security in some particular context, or might not be aware of what best practices actually entail. That's the first possible can't. The second can't relates to possible failures of education or capacity, such as where, despite good intentions, a government may not know how to strengthen nuclear security in its country in order to come up to appropriately high standards, or where perhaps it lacks the resources or capabilities necessary to do so. That's the second can't. The third can't relates to governmental bandwidth and the challenges of prioritization in a world that is, of course, full of pressing challenges, such as where a government may be unable to address nuclear security properly because relevant leaders or personnel are preoccupied with meeting some other pressing challenge or threat in their context. Now, as a practical matter, it is not, of course, always easy to solve the challenges presented by these 3 can'ts. But most of the diplomatic engagement, or much of it anyway, that we engage in the ISN Bureau, as well as in the Department of Energy and in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, not to mention in the IAEA itself, much of that work is indeed devoted to helping partner states handle these particular problems. And we've got a pretty good track record of working with countries to improve things when it comes to the can'ts. Things are a little bit more challenging on occasion, however, with regard to what I describe as the 2 won'ts. Some countries simply choose to de-emphasize nuclear security, or in some sense perhaps even hostile to it. The first potential won't relates to the perceived costs of appropriate nuclear security, or competing economic interests, such as where parties convince themselves that proper nuclear security measures will unduly increase the expense of equipment or capabilities that they wish to acquire. This attitude may perhaps tempt them to cut corners, sometimes potentially quite dangerously. Similarly, a supplier may see security as a needless cost that can be shirked in the name of sales or market share. All such thinking, I would argue, is very short-sighted, of course, since just as with nuclear safety, if you are truly worried about cost, the worst possible outcome would be to face a dangerous nuclear incident resulting from one's own negligence in this respect. All the same, such attitudes can sometimes be a problem. That's the first won't. The second won't is more a pathology of outlook, if you will. Believe it or not, as I indicated before, some countries may still resist nuclear security measures because they feel that a focus upon nuclear security is perhaps some kind of a Western imperialist imposition or some such. At best, I think such a contention is simply silly. At worst, such positions might in fact smack of a sort of shameful cultural essentialism or even racism, as if to imply that prudence and competence and common sense can be monopolized by any particular culture, and that the peoples of the global south are incapable of them. We should all fiercely resist any such nonsense and rebut it resolutely. But this second won't sometimes takes a form to which I have alluded already, and that is a suspicion that there may be some kind of tension between nuclear security and the widespread sharing of nuclear benefits. This can take the form, in other words, of the belief that promoting security is somehow intrinsically comes at the cost of inhibiting cooperation. Now, by this point, you will not be surprised to hear that I completely disagree with this approach. I think it's quite wrong and misguided. Both safety and security, just to emphasize yet once again, the mantra that they are enablers and facilitators of cooperation. And it would be very difficult to imagine cooperation occurring or even continuing, let alone expanding, without it being quite clear that safety and security were being well handled. But in order to address this alternative manifestation of the second won't, I think it is important that we all, again, pay reference to the collective commitment paper that I referred to before, because it does articulate these points, I think, quite well. Namely, that there is no tension between security and cooperation, and that cooperation rests in large part upon the foundation that is provided by good security. So, in parallel with concrete capacity building assistance to help with the can'ts, this kind of diplomatic outreach to help with the won'ts, I think, is a very important part of what we must all be up to raise awareness, to demonstrate the positive value of nuclear security, and to encourage all governments to develop the political will to follow through in the promise-keeping business of nuclear security. So that's my sort of tour d'horizon of the nuclear security business as we engage with it in the Department of State. And I hope that a good many of our colleagues on the Nuclear Security Contract Group will also see it in this fashion as we work together to support these very important objectives. Hopefully these remarks have given you a little bit of a taste of the work that we do in this area, and that you yourselves, perhaps, as experts and thought leaders in this arena, will be able to help contribute to this effort as we move forward together in the months and years ahead. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to taking questions that I have every confidence will range across a much broader range of issues.
Chris,
This
thank you.
being Washington.
Join me here, Chris.
I'm supposed to turn this on, right?
Well done, right? Well done. You're a seasoned veteran at this. Chris, as you look out in the audience, you see, I am sure, many familiar faces.
I do.
And it represents a pretty remarkable breadth of expertise. They have opinions, and they are going to want to share them with you, I suspect. So I want to quickly get to that, but first maybe I could just ask you a couple of questions to warm you up and pick up on a couple of things that you said. You started by talking about the kind of relative utility of the nuclear security summit process, and then ended with some of the challenges that you see and that the administration, and we all, in fact, have in terms of encouraging governments around the world to take nuclear security not just seriously, but seriously and in an enduring way. So I want to press you a little bit on your views of the relative success of the NSS process, which I think is rightly debatable in terms of, did it create kind of long-term a long-term set of circumstances that has fundamentally improved nuclear security around the world. What I think is indisputable about the NSS, however, I think you'll agree, is that it raised the level of political attention around the issue that certainly drove budgets in fundamentally different ways than had been the case previously. It matters almost as much as what we are saying as who is saying it. So when it's an office director saying it, it is one thing. When it's presidents and prime ministers saying it, it's another. So I guess the question that I have for you, drawing from your remarks, is now that we have kind of left the NSS in our rearview mirror, and we have adopted an America First approach across our foreign policy, isn't this making your job more difficult rather than easier?
Well, your question as to whether the degree to which this summit process created long-term changes in circumstances, and the answer I think is very clearly, well, not yet, but that's not surprising. The whole purpose of this, is, as I understand these things, was to catalyze commitments that will help change. The objective is not to have good joint statements at the end of a meeting. The objective is to have better nuclear security practices on the ground. And that process was moved forward, and commitments were made that represent important milestones for trying to achieve that ultimate objective of new and better facts on the ground. And it's up to all of us now to, as I indicated in my remarks, go from that sort of promise-making phase to making all of those best practices just what we almost unthinkingly and routinely do every day. That is a work in progress. It's not done yet, but the summit's contributed, I think, in important ways to doing that, and now it's up to us to build forward all of those practices into the everyday sort of neural habits and muscle reflexes of how every stakeholder approaches their job in the nuclear security business and in related fields that impinge upon nuclear security in various ways. So that's all underway, and I regard what we're doing now as being a natural follow-on from that process. One would have had to move in that direction irrespective of administration. It was something that the Obama administration, as I understand it, was already starting to do in the last year or so that it was in office. And I hope that between the catalytic effect of the summit process itself and the more day-to-day slog of trying to make these things feel just normal and everyday, I hope that we will be able to have something to show for these two facets of what I think is a very important collective effort.
Mm-hmm. And does America First make it more difficult for you?
In this context, nuclear security scratches everyone's itch. It certainly supports American security interests and foreign policy interests to have there not be terrorists and rogue regimes easily able to access materials that are outside regulatory control. I think that meets everyone's security interests. So there's no tension between any of those values in this context. I think they work very nicely together, and they can be complementary and reinforce each other. Mm-hmm.
I want to come back to the issue of burden sharing, because that's really what the summit process was about, right? It's kind of spreading the love, spreading the lift around the globe. So next year, of course, the United States will chair the G7 process, including the global partnership. So you didn't mention the global partnership in your remarks. You mentioned you obviously did not focus on them. I'm not saying you excluded them deliberately, but I want to ask you if that represents, the fact that you didn't raise it, the fact that it wasn't top of your mind, does that represent a diminishment in the relative importance in the administration's view of the global partnership, or tell me what your thinking is?
Oh, not at all. It remains very important. We work very hard on this. One of the things that we are actually, I'm personally proudest of that we've done in the last couple of years is to try to bring the global partnership sort of programming side and the capacity building work and the engagements that are so important in areas like nuclear security together more closely with the policy engagements that we have in things such as the Non-Proliferation Directors Group within the G7 process, so that the policy and the programming sides are able to have more contact, more engagement, to make sure that programming more cleanly and crisply and effectively represents the very policy objectives that we're talking about. And I think that synergy that we encouraged the last two chairs of the G7 process to do is paying off, and we're going to certainly keep that emphasis under our chairmanship in 2020. One of the things that the G7 has been very active in doing as well, I should say, is under the French presidency, there's been a lot of outreach efforts in support of universalization of the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials. And that has been a very effective process. It is one of our important goals, and we are delighted to be joined in that by our G7 partners. That is also something you will see continue under the U.S. presidency of the G7 in 2020. So I think these are all, once again, very complementary. I meant no disrespect to the global partnership. It was perhaps an oversight. But no, it's a major piece of what we're doing, and I think it's a very effective tool. I'm very proud of, in particular, of the capacity building programming that we do. At my bureau alone, we have something on the order of $250 million that is used for a variety of capacity building engagements, and that is a critical piece of what it is. I mean, there are analogous challenges to the can'ts and the won'ts that I mentioned before in nuclear security across a whole range of engagements, whether it is getting partners to improve their capacity to meet the requirements of Resolution 1540, for example, all the way to improving export control and border security challenges, helping countries with model legislation for how to do these things more effectively. There's a whole world of practice sharing and cooperative engagement that we engage in all the time that I think works really nicely hand in hand with the things that you're describing.
So you mentioned the CPPNM amendment. So let me press you on that a little bit as well. We have a review conference, obviously, in 2021. Can you tell me how the administration is planning on leveraging that in support of its kind of wider nuclear security agenda?
Well, sure. I think, again, these are powerfully complementary. One of the things that I hope that the collective commitment paper that the NSCG has come up with will be useful for is helping the like-minded group that the NSCG represents, helping guide and shape their efforts to make the most out of the upcoming CPPNM review conference. Same thing can be said of the upcoming ICONS, the ministerial that's coming up in, I believe, February. we are all in the position of needing to coordinate our diplomatic activity to make sure that as much is gotten out of these as possible. Pushing for CPPNM universalization is a major piece of this, for example. But as we get ready in the review conference to assess, as one needs to, the adequacy and success, progress of the convention, having this kind of a focal point for where it is that we think that nuclear security needs to be going, and trying to use the convention to achieve its goals most effectively by having this kind of collective focusing of effort. I think that's a major piece of what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. So I want to come back to your won'ts and can'ts, which I think is really interestingly framed. You referenced the Global South.
Sounds like a Maoist slogan.
Doesn't it?
I apologize for that. I read too much Chinese strategic writing. It sort of seeps into the brain. So.
You mentioned the Global South a couple of times in your remarks, Chris. And I want to know how you, when you're out and about beyond that my Canadian accent comes through.
I love it.
I can interpret for you. We can get an interpreter up here for you if you'd like. When you're around the globe, particularly in countries of the Global South, how do you effectively communicate the mission that you have on nuclear security, on non-proliferation, to governments whose girls may not be being educated, who are facing famine, who are facing an infectious disease outbreak, whose infrastructure may be in tatters, who are in a post-conflict environment, who are so many other priorities that, quite rightfully, if I were in their shoes, I would certainly prioritize over your mission that you're telling me needs to be high on my agenda. How do you communicate that, and how does the administration kind of conceive of a strategy to engage those prospective partners in the nuclear security agenda?
Well, the discussion usually wouldn't come up unless it were in the context of what they see as their own agenda in some way. Nuclear cooperation is a critical piece of many countries' agendas. It is a way in which, of course, as we all know, the sort of quaint phrase from the Eisenhower era, the benefits of the peaceful atom. Okay, cliched it may be, but there's a truth there that has always been part. Everyone knows the sort of dangerous side of nuclear technology, but it's not often as widely recognized in the public, at least. So there's this extraordinarily beneficial side that goes far beyond just the generation of electrical power in a clean and carbon zero sort of way. But it also goes to the ways in which nuclear technologies and their applications can help, of course, in agriculture, industry, science, medicine, basic research of all sorts. There's a whole world of benefit out there that I think many leaders, even from the countries to which you're referring, are very focused upon. They very much, in many cases, want those kinds of benefits, whether it's desalination or work to sterilize insects that carry debilitating disease, help with cancer treatment, or whatever it may be. These are all benefits that countries around the world all very much want to be able to take advantage of. And our message on nuclear security is to simply point out the basic fact that our agenda of nuclear security is not separate from their agenda of cooperation, which is ours as well. I mean, we're a massive supporter of the IAEA's technical cooperation program, for example. We provide enormous amounts of U.S. assistance bilaterally for these kinds of projects as well, through the Department of Energy, for example. And so making it clear that the agenda of cooperation on these kinds of prosperity and health furthering projects is not a separate question from that of nuclear security, and that without it being clear that nuclear security issues will be adequately handled, whatever that means in any given context, of course, because it varies, but without that linkage being clear, it's very possible that there would be less sharing. I mean, the odds of a sharing system surviving in the world where it is not clear that materials and technology would not be misused are pretty low. And so what we try to do is point out that these agendas are not different and they complement each other, and that paying attention to nuclear security is a way to help ensure that the kind of sharing that these countries and their peoples so very much want and that we very much wish to provide will be possible and remain possible. So I think these, again, are complementary things, and emphasizing that complementarity is a big piece of our diplomacy in this regard.
So I want to bring the audience in. We're going to get some microphones out here, but before I turn to them, I'm not going to let you off the stage until I ask you a North Korea question. So Kim Jong-un has given us a deadline to the end of the year to kickstart discussions on a deal between the United States and DPRK. Can you tell me what more we can do to get them back to the table and move this discussion along?
Well, I will defer those questions, I'm afraid, to Steve Began, who is our negotiator on all such matters. Certainly from the perspective of the rest of the department, we are working very hard to make it possible and set the conditions for the kind of negotiated denuclearization that we have, of course, all long been hoping for. We are simultaneously implementing a pressure campaign, of course, to incentivize coming to the table, while working with Steve and his team to make sure that we in the U.S. government as a whole and with interagency partners, as appropriate, are prepared for a yes answer, too, right? I mean, we need to be in a position to effectively implement negotiated threat elimination in North Korea if that comes out of the negotiations, which we very much hope that it will. And the pressure campaign that we are implementing can, of course, be turned off, and we are looking forward to the day when we can do that because we have achieved the goals that the President has set for us in his repeated meetings with Chairman Kim. So we are trying to be as prepared as we can for that outcome, and we wish our negotiators well, and will provide all the detailed technical support that they need to do this, but I would defer to them on exactly where we are going with all this, because this is very much a work in progress as we speak.
Very good. So let me turn to the audience here, ma'am. We'll get a microphone to you, and if you would kindly just state your name, your affiliation, and make sure that your 15-second intervention ends with a question mark, I'd be grateful.
It will definitely end with a question mark. Hi, I'm Samantha Necris from NTI. Thank you for coming. I wanted to turn back to the CPP&M Amendment Review Conference and get a little bit more specific than the previous question. This is obviously a unique instrument. It's the only international legal treaty that requires physical protection. It's almost universal, not quite. We're working on that. But it also has a mechanism that if countries will take advantage of it, can be a tool for sustainable dialogue, sustainable attention, and also for sustaining the regime itself. I wanted to get your views on what you believe the role of the RevCon can be, the future RevCons, and also your views on the timing of future RevCons and whether countries should, in fact, agree to those RevCons in 2021.
Oh, sure. I know there's a lot of debate about the details of how exactly this kind of an approach should be built out. We are, obviously, as I've indicated, very strongly supportive of the convention and its universalization. The RevCon that's coming up, I think, can and will be a very useful opportunity for everyone to sit down and sort of assess where things have come, where they should be going, how adequate the convention is to the goals that we all espouse in this respect. And so we're very, very much looking forward to that and making sure that it is as successful as we can. As to future RevCons, we think that's something that we should all collectively play by ear. Rather than committing in advance to any particular given institutionalized cycle of things, we should sort of see where we are. And we'll know a lot more once this review conference occurs. And I think that that additional information about how and where everyone has been going on these issues will be an important data point in trying to figure out where we should go in terms of future RevCons. But we're content to try to make that make those decisions when we know more at that time. But so specific timing, we should make that call when we're wiser and better informed, and we all will be as a result of this conference, to which we are all looking forward very much.
Yeah, we'll go here. I'll come and get you in a minute here, Daryl.
Liz Kim from Voice of America Korean Service. Follow up on the North Korean question. 6 months ago, you said that one-time solution is what the United States is pursuing with North Korea. Is the United States still aiming that solution with the North Korea? And could you tell us in detail what one-time solution would mean in detail?
Well, our objective, of course, is the final and fully verified denuclearization that President Trump and Chairman Kim have talked about, and to which Chairman Kim has promised to move. Our policy hasn't changed in that respect. As to the details of what it actually looks like, I certainly wouldn't want to get out in front of specific negotiations before they begin in detail. But so as I indicated before, we stand ready to implement that vision and that agreement, and hope that we hear agreement from the North Korean side as soon as possible.
Chris, you mentioned the global initiative to combat nuclear terrorism and our collaboration with Russia, and how well, actually, that is one of the few areas of open collaboration between the two countries. I wonder if you could give us a little bit more color on what that looks like, and also give us 2 lines on what your collaboration with Beijing looks like
On nuclear security?
nuclear security.
It is principally bilateral in engagement. I actually had a very interesting visit over to, I think they call it their Nuclear Security Center of Excellence, which is a little bit outside of Beijing. Was taken there a couple of years ago on an absolutely frigid winter day, but had a great tour of the facility. They are beginning to play a role regionally in training folks from that area of the world in nuclear security related skills and techniques. It's part of a capacity building effort that hopefully will have good results. So we have engaged closely with them in those endeavors. I believe they are, I'm trying to remember I think they have been indeed part of our discussions at the contact group as well, that helped produce the collective commitments document that I was referring to earlier. So we've actually had pretty good engagement with the Chinese on this, and certainly hoping for to see more come out of this. The Russian engagement continues to be pretty good through GRCNT. I was privileged to be at the plenary meeting in Argentina last year, at which, thankfully, it was agreed that we should continue to co-chair with the Russians. And it was quite sort of strange and unusual for this day and age. I read a congratulatory greeting to the group from President Trump, and my Russian counterpart read one from Vladimir Putin. One doesn't hear those things in quite that way at most international fora, so it was actually a pleasure to see those signs of cooperation as the group continues to work, and we're looking forward to continuing our role and co-chairing it with our Russian colleagues.
Very good. Daryl.
Thank you. Hi, Chris. Daryl Kimball. I didn't know you were from Cincinnati. I'm from Oxford, so we have some things to share in that area.
Oxford, Ohio.
Oxford, Ohio.
Yeah.
It's the real Oxford.
Last week was reported
I got to be careful with that, but okay.
Last week it was reported that Russia formally proposed the 5-year extension of New START. And as you know, your fellow officials in the administration have said at various points that they're interested in a new deal with Russia, possibly one that also includes China. But putting aside the question of whether such an agreement is desirable or necessary, my question is whether you believe there's even time for such a negotiation of a new agreement before New START is due to expire in 13 months. Yes or no? And if there is time, who's leading the negotiation? What's the plan? When's the next round of talks? Because 13 months is not very much time. And if there's not enough time, then don't you agree that extending the treaty would provide the president with more time to pursue his more ambitious idea?
It's Daryl Kimball with a 14-part question.
Oh, no worries. No, I would say on the issue of New START extension, as my colleagues have made, I think, very clear, this is something that is certainly under consideration. We haven't made a decision one way or the other. We are approaching that question in part through the prism of how and whether and to what degree the question of New START extension can contribute to what we think is by far the more important objective, and that is to find a framework for arms control that is capable and will help nip in the bud the emerging three-way arms race in the nuclear arena that I fear that Russian and Chinese nuclear posture and regional military strategies and threats to our allies is threatening to create. Finding a way to get our arms around that problem and find the kind of trilateral answer to the arms control challenge to which President Trump has repeatedly referred in public is our cardinal objective. And we are looking at issues such as, not exclusively, but including New START extension from the perspective of how we can most contribute to finding that long-term answer. And I do stress that we need a long-term answer, a longer-term answer to these challenges, because even if it were extended, New START only goes for an additional 5 years. Already the Russians are building things outside the New START context. We see them, this remarkable new bestiary of strategic delivery systems that Vladimir Putin was bragging about in his video production in March of last year. This is including a new super heavy ICBM, the infamous flying Chernobyl of the Budapestnik nuclear cruise missile. There's an underwater drone powered by a nuclear reactor and carrying nuclear weapons. There's an air-launched ballistic missile, of all things. This weird new bestiary, it is, most of that will presumably not be covered under New START under any scenario. So they're already building things that are not reached by the New START framework. The Chinese, of course, are on a trajectory to at least double size of their nuclear arsenal within the next 10 years. This is and of course that's leaving aside the issue of Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons. And those of us who've been around Washington for a while will remember that when the New START treaty was ratified in the Senate, it was made very clear at the time that it was essential that non-strategic weapons in Russian hands be part of any future arms control agreement. These are all challenges that are sort of coming together at the same time, and it is really imperative that we find some way of addressing the Russian and Chinese challenges in an arms control framework. And there is no way to do that at present. Our objective is to find that way, and engaging with them to try to bring that to fruition is the cardinal focus of our arms control efforts right now.
Chris, you didn't answer my question. If you could answer my question, is there time to negotiate a new agreement that addresses all of those issues before February 5, 2021?
I think there is plenty of time to engage with them and to move that objective of a trilateral framework forward, and we're looking forward to doing that.
We're going to get a microphone up here to Ambassador Holgate and the bearded and mustachioed man on the other side.
Really, I need to. So, thanks, Chris, for your comments. I could probably have made 90% of your speech, showing that there's a lot of important continuity on nuclear security. Curious to hear more about the administration's approach to making the most of the upcoming international conference on nuclear security. As you quite rightly said, it's time to have nuclear security be muscle memory. ICONS is part of that, in that it's every 3 or 4 years by the IAEA. But yet it's also a chance to have ministers in place, to have them say something consequential in their statement. And since the vast majority of the 935 pledges made during the summit era have been achieved, to make future commitments and identify progress made. What steps is the U.S. government taking to get other countries to show up at the ministerial level with a progress report and new pledges in the ICONS meeting?
Well, we're certainly working very hard to encourage high-level representation. This is a major part of the engagements that we have had with the Nuclear Security Contact Group, for example, and getting, there's a multiplier effect in multilateral approaches here that I think you'll probably be familiar with. We are trying to use our work with the contact group to help catalyze that kind of engagement, to bring as many to the conference and at as high a level as possible, for the same purposes that you're describing. So this is a work in progress. This is coming up actually I think it's in February, if I recall correctly. So we're getting down to the wire and making sure that we push these, pull these levers and push these buttons as effectively as we can. But that's something that we're actively working on with our partners, among other things, through the Nuclear Security Contact Group, their most recent meeting of which I think was just a couple of weeks ago.
Very good. Here, and then we'll go up to the far side as well.
Thank you. Michael Crapon, Stimson Center. Welcome to Stimson, Chris. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. We remember these words of Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. Are they worth repeating? Do they have utility at the present moment with this Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference coming up?
Potentially, and this is one of the many topics that people are chewing on as we get ready to try to make the review conference as productive as we can. Setting the appropriate atmosphere for it is certainly an objective for all sorts of states. That's true amongst us in the P5. I think, my own personal inclination is that while slogans like that are often useful, concrete results and pragmatic efforts to actually address security problems that make movement towards nuclear disarmament more challenging would be an even better signal to send, which is one of the reasons why we're so pleased to have countries coming together through, for example, but not exclusively, the Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament initiative that we have been very proud to be working on for the last few months. The second round of that engagement happened, I think, just a couple of weeks ago in the UK. The working groups in that group, under that initiative, beginning to build out lines of inquiry and terms of reference for their work to try to help answer some of the questions that need to be addressed in finding ways to ameliorate conditions in the security environment. It's that challenge of conditions in the security environment that I think is the real crux of the problem here. And if you were to refer to Ronald Reagan words, I would refer you to the remarks I think he made in May of 1989 in Moscow Polytechnic, if I recall correctly. Anyway, there was a comment about how we do not distrust each other because we have arms. We have arms because we distrust each other, or something to that effect. And so, so there you have Reagan himself pointing to what I think is the underlying challenge that we face of how it is that we affect and improve the environment in a way that will make movement forward on all these fronts more feasible rather than less feasible. We didn't get to the dramatic arms reductions in the post-Cold War period by any means other than having the underlying tensions and stresses of that relationship with the Soviet Union at the time wane. We shouldn't put the cart before the horse and try to pretend that we can address the challenges presented by nuclear tools unless we are able somehow to address the underlying challenges presented by a fraught strategic relationship. And so it's by addressing those kinds of security concerns, and that's why I go back to the trilateral issue in particular, because the security environment one is now, unfortunately, in a sense, one in which the challenges of traditional bilateral approaches to arms control mechanisms are no longer adequate to the at least trilateral challenges that we face in the world. And that's not even counting the incipient arms race, or the full-blown arms race, I should say, in South Asia. There are many problems that we need to figure out how to address here. And the way that you get at that, I would argue, is by focusing upon trying to find ways to solve, or at least ameliorate, the challenges of that security environment. And from that, real concrete results, I think history shows, can and will follow. But I'd be more inclined to sort of focus upon trying to get countries together on trying to address those problems than simply to find felicitous ways to describe them.
Chris, what's the single biggest obstacle to a successful NPT review?
I'm not sure there is a single biggest. There are multiple scenarios which don't help. We've had review conferences blow up before because of some parties' insistence upon trying to use NPT mechanisms to browbeat countries to the table with whom they are not themselves willing to engage at all, and to use mechanisms to try to achieve outcomes specifically in the Middle East with respect to the Middle Eastern, the idea of a Middle Eastern zone free of weapons of mass destruction and delivery systems. There have been very counterproductive attempts to force engagement upon countries that are not willing to engage directly amongst themselves. That has derailed review conferences before. That's certainly one scenario. Our hope is that we can, our diplomacy in the NPT front is focused upon trying to, especially at this 50th anniversary of the NPT, to try to draw people's attention to the ways in which the treaty has in fact served the interest of all parties. It is often, aspects of the treaty are often controversial one way or the other, but I think on the whole, this opportunity to look back at a half century of its being in place is a great opportunity to remind ourselves of what it has brought in terms of security benefits to all countries. And I don't mean just security benefits, the framework of the NPT is a reciprocal exchange of security commitments so that every single state party, including and perhaps especially the non-weapon states, gain in a security sense from the treaty. Because I know, as a non-weapon state, that you're not going to be weaponizing. You know that I'm not going to be weaponizing. That sets a framework for international cooperation and mutual security that should not be underestimated and has been incredibly powerful over the last 5 decades of the treaty's existence. But it's not just in terms of that security benefit. The treaty has provided just the kind of foundation that I was referring to in the nuclear security context through its safeguards approach. The idea of nuclear safeguards and nonproliferation has been essential to facilitating the world of cooperative benefit sharing when it comes to all those benefits of nuclear technology to which I was referring before. Without that framework of the nonproliferation regime, you would not see the kind of routinized, powerful, effective sharing of all of these benefits from power generation to medicine and health and agriculture and whatever else it may be. All of that rests upon the foundation that the nonproliferation regime has provided. Reminding people of that is really important. The issue of disarmament. You could not imagine disarmament agenda moving forward were there not a nonproliferation regime in place to prevent newcomers from swarming into the space, to the vacuum created, if you will, by relinquishment of nuclear weapons that we all hope will happen. So in all these ways, the treaty has been incredibly important to providing foundational structures that we all depend upon for really important pieces of our day-to-day international policy agenda. And we need to use this opportunity of the 50th anniversary to remind all states party of that, so that they can recommit themselves to ensuring that all those kinds of benefits continue to be available to all of us around the world, the global south, the global north, the east, the west, whatever it may be, to keep these benefits available for another 50 years, so that when they have a 100th anniversary review conference, they can sit around and talk about what a relief it was that all those people back in 2019 and 2020 didn't mess it up and kept folks committed to the structure of this treaty that's been so profoundly beneficial to so many.
Very good. Sir, I think we had a question, one last question, if we could squeeze in, with your permission.
No, it's fine, yeah.
All right.
Yes, Edward F. Hoover Institution. Chris, you just addressed my question, which was SEND. Perhaps you could provide a little more detail about how SEND is going. I understand there are 3 working groups. How is that going? What's the relationship between SEND and the IPNDV? And are you trying to achieve some results from SEND that could play into next year's NPT RevCon?
Okay. The Creating an Environment for Nuclear Disarmament initiative, SEND, as you were saying, recently had its second round of meetings in the UK, as I indicated before. This was a series of meetings of the working groups, each of which is designed to explore a particular line of inquiry. What the plenary meeting in Washington, D.C. did in this last summer was identify 3 basic lines of inquiry that the participants in the plenary felt it important to pursue in order to try to find ways to find help find creative answers to some of the challenges that have kept disarmament from moving forward more effectively in this very challenging current security environment. One of those lines of inquiry has to do with what institutions need to be developed and built or augmented or whatever it may be in order to help provide a framework for the international community's efforts to move towards and to sustain the achievement of nuclear disarmament. So that's sort of the institutional piece. Another working group is looking at the challenges of incentives created by the security environment, incentives that could, for various reasons, good or ill, either create reasons for countries to wish to acquire nuclear weapons or to not wish to acquire nuclear weapons, create incentives for possessors to retain or not to retain such weapons, and trying to think through the questions of the challenges of how it is that the security environment shapes those kinds of nuclear possession-related incentives, and what we can do to nudge those incentives more in a direction that is conducive to disarmament movement. And the third group relates to issues of what you might call risk reduction, and that is to say there will of course be some period of time, long or short, between the present day and the day at which all of this hopefully comes to fruition in a world that is safely and sustainably free of nuclear weapons. During that time, we're going to have to continue to manage the many nuclear challenges that exist in the world in ways that are as sort of safe and manageable as possible. That goes to issues of arms control, escalation management, crisis stability, transparency and confidence building measures, and that sort of thing. So the third group is looking at sort of what we can do during that interim period to manage the multiple nuclear deterrent standoffs and dynamics in the world as effectively as we can. So this most recent meeting in the UK was designed to sort of set terms of reference for how each of those lines of inquiry will be pursued over the coming months and perhaps years. We do hope that it will be possible for the SEND participants or the chairs of the working groups, for example, to brief the RevCon on the progress that they've been making and where they see their particular working groups going. I do want to stress that the CND effort is separate from and it is separate from the NPT process. We hope it's complementary, but we need this discussion, I think, of disarmament issues to be done independently of purely NPT processes insofar as clearly as the situation in South Asia and perhaps elsewhere suggests the challenges of nuclear weapons management and ultimately elimination are ones that cannot be addressed solely within the current membership of the NPT, and we don't want to get snagged on those very politically contested rocks there. We hope that it will be possible to feed wisdom into the NPT process and to demonstrate through CEND that there is actually serious work being done to try to address these many challenging questions. But we envision this being sort of complementary to and perhaps in parallel with the NPT process, even though we hope that they will usefully inform and enrich each other. So that's sort of where it is at the moment. As to where we are ultimately going, I'm trying to avoid being very prescriptive about that, because this is a process that we feel belongs to the participants themselves. We didn't sort of dictate an agenda for where this should be going. The plenary meeting, these lines of inquiry arose out of plenary discussions between countries that involved an extraordinary diverse range of perspectives. We had people from the north, the south, the industrialized world, the non-industrialized world. We had members of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, as well as Nuclear Alliance participants. We had the P5 there. We had people from both sides of all the major political and economic and ideological fault lines in South Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Bringing that group of people together and having the discussions that we had in the plenary is where those lines of effort emerged from. And this wasn't directed by anyone. And so I can't, in all honesty, describe exactly where it's going to be going, because each of these lines of effort will work as they feel they need to work. And they'll work to develop answers and perhaps deliverables and points of emphasis as they feel their particular line of inquiry requires. I don't know where that's going to go. And in some ways, that's actually a strength of the process, not a weakness. I know it's frustrating not to be able to predict end states and outcomes. But if this is to be the kind of engagement that it really needs to be, if we are to try to address some of these security challenges, you don't know the answers in advance. If we knew the answers, this wouldn't be hard. It would be simple. It's precisely because we need to develop these answers, and because the traditional disarmament discourse has been, in my own personal view, fairly poor at providing answers to some of these underlying security challenges. It's for that reason that we need to allow participants the opportunity to engage in really candid, thoughtful, and hopefully wise discussions of where to go with these groups. And I wish them luck, and I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes myself.
Chris, your willingness to come back to this stage and other stages like it, to listen to sometimes divergent opinions, to share views, and to onboard ideas is really commendable. And I want to thank you for being here today and for your service.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.